Okay, the progressive movement is on its way in Rhode Island.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Welcome in. As I told you, after the election, we're going to bring on all sorts of new folks into the General Assembly. And Sam Bell, who is not a stranger to the show, he's been here before, as an advocate, as an activist, not as a candidate or an elected official, but he's just won a state Senate seat in Providence, and we'll welcome him in momentarily. Great to have you aboard. The news out of Washington is getting kind of interesting. And the media now, of course, is beginning to chum up a little bit, which is going to surprise and probably bother a lot of you who watch media in silos. I'm conservative. I only watch Fox. I'm liberal. I only watch CNN or MSNBC. Well, guess what? Sometimes the twain have to meet. Here's a headline. As futile as it may be, Fox News stands with CNN on passes for working White House journalists. This is all about the Jim Acosta story, right? He was, tussling with the president, and the intern came over, and now we got the slow motion videos, and, whether it's, push, pull, or whatever, and tug on the microphone. But the Justice Department, which has been in some ways perverted by this White House now, is responding with its own, guess what? The president can do anything he wants at any time with journalists at whatever cost. In fact, the argument from the Justice Department in a multi-page response to the lawsuit is that the First Amendment doesn't extend to the president in terms of rights of the press, that the president can bring in anybody he wants into the White House to cover him if it's a bunch of people who are nothing but yes people. In other words, the entire crew could be nothing but Fox News. That's his purview. If he wanted nothing but argument from CNN or MSNBC or anywhere else. And again, these branding and these identifying labels I don't think are necessarily intellectually honest either. But the point is, he can have who their position is. He can have anybody he wants to have in there. So that's the response to the lawsuit. I will tell you, a non-lawsuit response would be this spiraling problem. Well, guess what? The press corps can walk away. If Fox and CNN feel like they want to merge for a bigger point of view, and that is protection of First Amendment journalistic rights in their minds, they can also say, you know what? Okay, you can have whoever you want in there, or we're not covering you. How's that? Now, that might seem like a childish response, and it's not going to improve their business models, nor their ratings or revenue. And by the way, which is the priority? Truth, ratings, or revenue? There's another deep conversation. But this is all the president's doing, and in the end, this will be the court of public opinion that will have much to do with whether Jim Acosta or anybody else gets their credential back. And Fox News weighing in support will matter. All right, which is good. All righty. In the meantime, Melania is upset. Now, this is classic. Now, Melania is upset. I don't know what this woman did, Deputy Security Advisor, to screw up with her trip in Africa. Now, Melania is flexing her elbows a little bit. Question will be, will hubby, the President of the United States, acquiesce to her demands? If not, we could have complete anarchy in the White House. I thought we had, then again, I thought we had, we kind of have anarchy. Crazy. Let's come home for a second. I just want to make this point because we have often criticized the State Department of Transportation when they screw things up. The headline here on the 610 connector work so far. Now, this is only the beginning. But when we find out that the commute has not been as long as they projected, and that the work is somewhat well organized, and that the commuters have well responded to the whole thing, we must give them an A for effort and for planning, because we don't often pat the DOT on the back. When we have the opportunity to do so, we shall. Now, who knows what the next adjustment brings, because it's all about the adjustments. But, after that 195 debacle where the governor didn't even know what was going on, I think it's appropriate to say, all right, guys, good job. And finally, the Women's Caucus, now a coverable issue for local media. Headline here, WPRI and Kim Kalunian's story on what they're talking about.
State Senator Janine Kalkin introducing a resolution Tuesday night to oppose reappointing House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello to his leadership role, a move that sparked debate within the Democratic Party's Women's Caucus.
This is a personal assault. This is a character assault.
This is all true.
I have a huge problem procedurally trying to do it this evening.
The group of party activists and elected leaders ultimately decided to table a vote on the resolution Tuesday. Their vice chair explaining it'll be posted online for members to voice their opinion ahead of the start of the session in January.
There are a lot of women who are unhappy with the way the Speaker has conducted business at the State House. And so, I do agree with the general sentiment, but I've not had time to review in detail what it says.
I haven't decided yet. I'll read it over. I really want to concentrate on policy, the importance of policy and the importance of process, and stay away from individuals.
The overwhelming majority of the representatives solidly support me.
On Thursday night, Mattiello was informally selected to lead the House of Representatives again during a closed-door caucus. The official vote will be held on January 1st. Mattiello's handling of a sexual harassment complaint against former House Judiciary Chair Cale Keeble has caused some House members to question his leadership.
It's always important to listen to everybody when you're in a leadership position, so that's certainly what we plan on doing.
By the way, it is the Women's Democratic Caucus, by the way. Here's our guest's headline. He won a race over longtime State Senator Paul Jabour. Before we get into all of that and the like, you have a take? Welcome. Congratulations.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You have a take on what the women are doing there? Any thought on it?
Well, it's always interesting to have two men here discussing the Women's Caucus, but
is that okay?
I think across the Democratic Party, Democrats want Democrats to lead our caucuses in the House and the Senate. And on so many core issues, our current leadership disagrees with the party's basic values. It's been well covered that they're both Senate President Dominic Ruggerio, House Speaker Nick Mattiello, both endorsed by Right to Life, both endorsed by the NRA. A couple issues they disagree on. Ruggerio voted against marriage equality. Mattiello did vote for it. They're both very politically conservative on economic issues. Ruggerio, has said he's opposed to repealing the tax cuts for the rich, which, of course, repealing the Bush tax cuts for the rich was the centerpiece of Obama's economic policy agenda. Mattiello has denied that it ever happened, for which PolitiFact gave him a false rating. And by and large, they're very politically conservative people who are well outside of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. So Democratic activists would like to have Democrats in charge in both the House and the Senate.
So that was Sam always brings a test. You have to listen carefully to what he said. By the way, Senate President Ruggerio, I believe, is booked for Tuesday of next week. So we're looking forward to that. Democrats want Democrats to lead. Well, Democrats are leading. We have a fissure right now in the Democratic Party, but I was really asking you, not that you came here to respond and or to be a man talking about women's political issues, but this is another identifiable caucus which has come through the Me Too and some of the sexual harassment challenges that the legislature has had, no doubt. Do you feel a kinship with this organization of women elected officials feeling like they need to be identified as such? Are there issues on your table as well?
Well, first of all, the Women's Caucus did not come out of the Me Too movement.
No, but the reporting and the the attention by the press and the media now is much more enhanced because of what's going on with Me Too and the sexual harassment. It's been the caucus has been active for a long. I'm just talking about people are paying attention to it.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So,
I think that it is important that we pay attention to the official processes of the Democratic Party. I was also just elected to the Democratic Party State Committee. And I think that it is really important that we have a conversation about how our official Democratic Party apparatus works. There were endorsements of candidates this cycle who shared absolutely nothing with the Democratic Party. One candidate who was holding up a Trump sign at the State House just 2 years before running, who was endorsed by the Democratic State Committee, and then later, of course, that endorsement was withdrawn. Also endorsing a candidate who had a long criminal record, another endorsement that was later withdrawn. But we need to talk about the way the Democratic Party official apparatus operates. And
whether it be a women's caucus doing so or not.
Well, the Women's Caucus is part of it. And, you know, the Women's Caucus was kicked out of the official Democratic Party headquarters. We need a Democratic Party leadership that will respect the party base. That means respecting the membership in all of our caucuses. And the Women's Caucus should be invited back into the Democratic Party headquarters.
All right. When we come back, we'll talk about a couple of key issues that reflect the newly elected senators' concerns. Stay with us.
You know, the bill that I put in called for us to use a secret ballot because, you know, it's obvious to me that if in voting for leadership you use this roll call vote, that the real purpose of the roll call vote is just to know who's for you, who's against you, and then, you know, to reward those who are for you and punish those who are against you.
That is Senator Donna Nusselbusch, who, along with Senator-elect Bell, raised a concern about how leadership is chosen. Now, if you've been watching the segment prior, you got a hint about some of your thoughts on this. Interesting, what Senator Nusselbusch wanted to do was to make the ballot for leadership secret. Now, you say secret, what about transparency? There's a difference between transparency and intimidation. I've always felt that votes for leadership of any kind in the quasi-public or public domain need to be secret so people can exercise their free will without fear of retribution, which includes unions, public employee unions in this state, which also do the hand raise thing. And everyone's got to kind of go, okay, but I got to go to work tomorrow. It's a problem across the board. However, Senator Nusselbusch, in an act of diplomacy, voted for Senate President Ruggiero, having not been successful in trying to cajole him into a secret ballot for the caucus. Legislation to get that done is an interesting prospect. I'm not sure about that, because I don't know what law can regulate behavior in the caucus necessarily. You didn't vote for him.
No.
You took a pass. Did you abstain or did you vote no?
Well, so I tried to vote no for McCaffrey. The first vote is for Majority Leader against Michael McCaffrey because of my strong disagreements with his issue positions, whether it's on a woman's right to choose, gun safety, his strong opposition to LGBT equality, including marriage equality, and his very politically conservative views on economic issues. I tried to vote no, but I was told that that vote wasn't procedurally accepted, so I had to either abstain or vote for him. So I would have preferred to enter a no vote as was allowed in the House caucus, but because it wasn't allowed, I had to enter an abstention.
Gotcha.
Senator Nusselbusch joined me on that vote against Michael McCaffrey. One of the key things about the secret ballot is that it's actually required by existing law, not in the Democratic caucus, but in the official vote on the House floor. The law requires that a balloting procedure be used, has not been followed in recent years, but it is what the law says.
A secret ballot without votes on the board?
Yes, that's what the law says.
You know what? I was unaware of that. When you get a chance, email me that, because I would love to see that language, because you're right, lately that's it. You know, it's been a very public affirmation.
So this is really important, because a big part of the argument that Senator Nusselbusch and I are making is that it's not just this is good policy, but it is what the law says that we have to do. Not in the caucus vote, but on the floor vote, it's what the law says. We haven't been following this law for years, but it is really important that we stand up there and follow the law.
So
even
if
we disagree
with
it,
so
we should
no
follow
green
it.
and red on the board. There's none of that?
What the law says is that a ballot must be used.
Okay, what's the difference between hitting the button and a ballot?
So ballots are pieces of paper. They're implied. There's an implication of secrecy. Now you might be able to have some sort of legal argument about twisting the interpretation of the law. People can always argue over the law. But the reality is almost every legal interpretation of ballot has been the ballot is a piece of paper, typically secret, sometimes required to be secret, and that's what a ballot is. By nature, a ballot is a secret piece of paper.
Right, so the term ballot is used for both the House and the Senate?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, let's push that aside for a second. Let's get to the principle of it, which I happen to agree with you on, which is that people are free to speak their mind in choosing leadership when they don't have to answer for it amongst their peers. Someone say, well, why wouldn't you want to answer for it? Well, there's a reality.
Absolutely.
What's the reality? What's your thought on what the reality is?
Well, look, there's a reason why the Democratic caucus in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate both use a secret ballot process in their selection of leadership. Because people get punished. People who have been outspoken against the leadership, even in the much milder national level. My congressman, Congressman Langevin, who criticized Pelosi, was punished by her. But in the Rhode Island General Assembly, the level of punishment is much higher, the level of intimidation is much higher. So it's extremely important that people be protected and be able to stand up and speak their conscience. One of the things that really surprised me about the political system in our state is how afraid so many legislators are to really say what they believe, and how much intimidation, how much power the leadership has over individual lawmakers, how difficult it is to stand up there and say what you actually believe in. It shouldn't be that way. And when it comes to the most important vote, people should be free from intimidation. You shouldn't have to be worried about losing your committee seats, your committee chairmanship maybe. You shouldn't have to worry about all your legislation never passing. Not that anyone ever passes legislation anyway, unless you're the leadership.
All right, so there is a little bit of power in numbers. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us. Oh, that surprised me. There's a headline that intrigued me. I actually think they were stealing my thought. Not that I'm the only one who's been thinking about the numbers this way, but with 21 progressives in the, or identify progressive winners, or at least, you know what? I haven't done I have to check. I haven't done the count, whether it's 21 still or more or less. But there were 21 elected officials who it was actually after Election Day and prior to the caucus, who said that they would vote against Speaker Mattiello in the House. I'll have to come up with the numbers. But the point is that if there are near 24 folks who are opposed to Speaker Mattiello in the House, and there are 9 Republicans, and there are, 30 votes together on process issues could provide a little bit of a challenge for the Speaker of the House. Politics makes very strange bedfellows sometimes. People who allege they are very right of center and those who are very left of center sometimes come together for reasons that aren't necessarily on the issues. The Senate breakout looks how, Sam, in terms of there's only 5 Republicans. What's our progressive count in the Senate?
Look, I mean, it depends on how you define it.
Right.
You know, I'd say something in the range of 13 to 14.
Okay, but you've been formally part of this progressive movement, identified as such, correct?
Sure, sure.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to go and label my colleagues. I'll let them speak for themselves.
Okay, but there's a lot of the political reality is there's a lot of head counting going on right now. There's a lot.
Certainly.
There's a category head counting exercise going on Smith Hill right now. There's a schism, right word? There's a thing right now in the Democratic Party. So when earlier in the show you heard Sam talking about democratic values, mainstream Democrats, leadership doesn't reflect, that's going to be a fun argument. I mean, your progressive values don't match up necessarily to my politics per se in general. I think you can a la carte some things where we can agree on. But it's going to be very fascinating to see whether this Democratic Party's core mainstream philosophies are going to be identified in a different way.
Well, look, the Republican Party in Rhode Island has a challenge, which is that the current leadership of the Democratic Party is so far to the right, much further to the right even than most Republican red state legislators, that it doesn't give them much room to the right to oppose the current leadership. So they often wind up opposing them from the left because there just isn't any room to the right. And they also represent districts that are genuinely swingy. There are very few very hard right parts of Rhode Island. Just about every part of Rhode Island is a district that a Democrat
Other than
could
Scituate.
win.
Scituate seems to be pretty rock
Michael
solid.
Marcello held that seat for a long time.
True.
And Democrats can win in any seat in Rhode Island. And for that reason, it makes it really difficult for Republican lawmakers to find ground on the right of the current leadership. So it creates a potential opportunity where some Republican lawmakers may join more traditional Democrats in votes against the leadership, and potentially, you know, maybe not on strongly ideological issues, but on process issues, there may be opportunities for the Republicans to work together.
Well, there's going to have to be some thinking going on, and it'll be fascinating. No, really, there's going to have to be some real clear thinking on the part of legislators to know why they're there, what they're fighting for. Are they fighting for process? Are they fighting for legislative priorities? I haven't heard much about budgets in the last 3-4 months. It's been a lot about, understandably, some women's issues, the sexual harassment controversies, progressive platforms. There's not a lot of talk about holding the line financially. I'm looking forward to having some significant debate with you over the course of your legislative career, now that you're elected, on some of these matters. But it will be interesting to see if there's a vetoable contingent in either the House or the Senate where people allegedly on the right, Republicans, I don't know in Rhode Island if they're on the right or not, your point was made, but whether there's a coalition that starts to burp up problems for the mainstream Democrats, the old line, more conservative Democrats.
There are enough votes among traditional Democrats in the Senate.
Traditional is a better word.
You know, traditional liberal Democrats like us in the Senate to be able to block a budget without Republican votes. The reality is, if you look historically, the reason why
you would just steal the traditional label from me as part of the fun. I mean, you're quick.
There's no stealing that's going on. You know, the values of the Democratic Party, everyone knows, is a party that is to the left of the Republican Party. It's America's center-left political party. The Republican Party is America's right-wing political party. That's what the Democratic Party is.
Well, no, in Rhode Island, it's while you claim center-left, there's a center-right. There's not very much very far right in Rhode Island anywhere, period. We know that. So it'll be interesting to see where those marriages are. Long story short, and I know you're a guy who can argue process, and it's going to be fun to have you in the legislature. What's your 30-second message? We didn't get to many issues today, but we will down the line. What is your 30-second message to the people after you've been elected, and what 2019 looks like?
As I told a lot of people when I was knocking on their doors, I'm not going to be able to get very much done because the current legislature doesn't work for Rhode Islanders. In order for us to pass the kind of real reforms that we need to fix our fundamental budget challenges so that we don't have crumbling schools, roads that are in almost as bad condition as the schools, basic services falling apart. In order to do that, we have to break the power of the right-wing machine that's run the Democratic Party. So we can do things like repeal the tax cuts for the rich and finally talk about where to invest instead of always talking about where to cut. The reality is, in order for us to take back our state, we're going to have to break the power of the political machine that's been running our state so badly for so long. So 2019, I think, is going to be about shaping the overall direction of what politics in Rhode Island is going to look like for the next few decades.
I told you it's going to be interesting. Thanks. Congratulations. Final word and we'll come back. There's no doubt that the traditional Democratic leadership that we've had in this state is under siege by Sam Bell and his peers, who tried to claim the mantle of traditional. So there will be arguments over what is traditional and what is not, which is going to require you and me to really pay attention to who we are as citizens, constituents, and voters. We'll see you on the radio at 3 on WPRO tomorrow. Good night.